This is Crinale's newest IEMs. Now, the more astute of you may be asking yourselves, Crin, what the hell are you on about? But for those of you with vision, you would see that within this block of metal lies this, the project Monolith. That's right, after many months of teasing, the Project Monolith is finally available for purchase, assuming it hasn't already been sold out. A quick summary: Project Monolith is Crinale's limited edition IEM for 2026, and it sports an 18-karat gold-plated brass monolithic shell that houses two independent dynamic drivers, 10mm and 8mm. On top of that, the Project Monolith is also the very first time that we'll be using our very own proprietary dynamic drivers, Crinale branded, if you will. We're also experimenting a little bit on the sound tuning side of things. We're going with quite a bit of bass, but of course with a focus on the usual natural mids and natural treble that you have all known us for at this point. And yes, the elephant in the room, this is a limited run IEM, 999 units only, for a price of $399 US. Every single unit of the Project Monolith will also be uniquely serialized from 001 all the way to 999, just like with the Project Meta. Every single unit of the Project Monolith will be inspected and QC'd by me personally, and as proof of that, I will also be signing every single box. Here's future crinacle slaving away at the factory signing the boxes. Look at him, how much he has suffered. The Project Monolith is exclusively available at Hangout.audio. We're not supporting any other retailers for our limited edition runs, so if you're interested, links are all down in the description. Again, assuming they're not all sold out. Those are just the quick bullet points, but as you all know, with videos like this, there's still so much for me to talk about, so if you would indulge me, let me get right into the nerd shit. First, let's talk about the project series, starting with the original Project Meta that we released last year, our debut model actually. Just like with the Project Monolith that we are launching today, the Project Meta was also limited to 999 units, and it served as a springboard for all the rest of the Crinale models to jump off of. We're very open about it. Without the Project Meta, Crinale as a brand probably wouldn't exist today. There would not be any Daybreaks, there would not be any references, there would not be any Protocol Maxes, so on and so on. The money that we earned from the Meta, we used to fund production of the Daybreak, which was again our very first production IEM. Now in 2026, we also want to launch another project, which comes with similar goals in mind. The Project Monolith, just like with the Project Meta, is a limited run for very similar reasons in that it is quite difficult to produce at scale. In the case of the Project Monolith, the prices are a little bit higher because it is, of course, a low production run. It has a more difficult production process, which I'll explain later, and we deliberately use more premium / luxurious materials. And just like with the Project Meta, the money that we earn from the Project Monolith is going to be used to directly fund production of future models that actually use technology in the Monolith. But what technology, you may ask at this point? Well, let's first look at the name Monolith, because I think it's actually a very apt description of what's actually going on in these IEMs. The Project Monolith uses what we call the multi-dynamic monolithic structure, or MDM for short. This kind of production process is also seen in a lot of other industries. Some of you may know it as unibody, monoblock, or even monocoque. What this means is that the entire body, or the entire shell, is fashioned out of a single piece of material. In the case of the Project Monolith, we use a single block of brass. We use a process called CNC machining, which is basically carving out the shell out of this little block. And this also includes things like the acoustic pathway. So after machining our shells, the only thing we have to do afterwards is slot the drivers into their respective chambers. This is rather different from the conventional ways in which IEMs are manufactured nowadays. For example, with PVC tubing, where there's a hollow shell and then you attach the drivers to some PVC tubings and then pull it out through the nozzle. And then there's also 3D printed shells with the tubes also printed in, which is also technically a unibody design, but the difference there is that you can only use resin. So what's the advantage of the current monolithic way in which we produce the Project Monolith? Well, for one thing, if you use something like PVC tubing, the drivers actually don't interact with the shell material. That means, for instance, like on the crinacle reference, which does use PVC tubing, even though it has a very nice aluminum shell, the drivers don't interact with anything other than the PVC tubing. And in the case of a 3D printed shell, as mentioned, it's only really available in resin, for now at least. Or you could have a 3D printed chamber inside of a hollow metal shell. But the problem with that is that now you have to account for two walls. One is the metal shell and the other is the wall of the chambers themselves. So these kinds of structures tend to be rather large, let's put it at that. With the monolithic design, we can keep everything extremely compact, which is why even though this is probably one of the heaviest IEMs we've ever released, it is also, currently at least, the smallest. As mentioned, the shell of the Project Monolith is brass, and we chose it for a very simple reason. I just wanted something very heavy. Brass is one of the densest reasonable metals that you can use in a production process today. I know that there are denser metals, but unless you're willing to shell out tens of thousands of dollars on an IEM made out of gold or platinum, that is not happening. Let's not even talk about tungsten, because CNCing that bitch is a nightmare. The gold plating on the Project Monolith is also in a shade called champagne gold. Now, this is actually rather hard to capture with a camera, but what champagne gold is kind of an in-between of yellow gold and rose gold. Yellow gold, as the name implies, is fairly yellow and personally looks a little bit gaudy. On the other hand, rose gold is quite reddish in the tint and can come off as quite coppery. In between two of these shades is a fairly neutral but still very luxurious shade in my opinion, and that is what we went with on the Project Monolith. But it's not just on the IEMs, no. The connectors on the cables themselves also come with the same 18 karat gold plated brass material. And on top of that, every single Project Monolith also comes with an 18 karat gold plated aluminum carrying case. Now, all this talk about a monolithic unibody design is pretty much an engineering flex at this point. But the weird thing is that all of this does not matter if your drivers are also not up to snuff. What this means is that while the monolithic design itself is actually exceedingly simple, tuning it, on the other hand, is pretty much impossible with off-the-shelf drivers. Which brings me to my next flex point. Within every Project Monolith, there are two dynamic drivers, one 10mm full range driver and an 8mm subwoofer driver. That doesn't really sound like anything special. After all, there are so many other dynamic driver IEMs out on the market today. But in our case, we can now finally tell the world that we are using crinacle branded dynamic drivers, entirely built from the ground up by us. First, let's talk about dynamic drivers, because even though our previous models, the Daybreak and the Reference, were hybrid or tribrid IEMs, now we have gone with an exclusively dynamic driver setup. So why? Dynamic drivers themselves are, first of all, cheap, of course, but they're also really robust and extremely versatile. Those of you who are familiar with measurements would also know that dynamic drivers have consistently shown the best distortion profiles out of any driver type on the market today. It is not even close. And in the context of full range drivers, dynamic drivers are unequivocally at the top at this point. So it's a mix of everything. In a one-to-one comparison scenario, dynamic drivers are almost always the superior choice in terms of a speaker unit. But on the other hand, because it's almost always seen as a full range solution, most people just use a single one. And tuning a single driver, while possible, you're also extremely limited in which directions you can actually tune the driver. And here is where we decided to go with the dual dynamic driver route. It gives us a lot more flexibility in how we can tune things, and it's also not our first rodeo, as you can see with the Truth Ear Zeros, all three of them. But a big issue is that this multi-dynamic monolithic design doesn't actually work unless you have drivers that are specifically developed for it. Now, normally when you work with a factory to make your own IEMs, you don't get to interact with the factory's suppliers. Could be the cable supplier, the accessory supplier, the shells, or in this case, the drivers. This is for very pragmatic reasons. As long as the job gets done, there is no need for the customer to be involved with every single supplier down the chain. But in this case, we want to be involved, at least in terms of the acoustics. So introducing Kingtone, what I would consider to be China's greatest IEM dynamic driver manufacturer. Kingtone is responsible for supplying some of the best Chinese dynamic driver IEMs, and within the OEM industry, they also have a reputation for being the premium option. So while dynamic drivers are often considered cheap, Kingtone builds them extremely well, QCs them extremely stringently, and as such, charges the highest for their workmanship. But it is worth every single yuan to me. Workmanship is what they have in spades. While many other dynamic drivers would go with a fully automated process to absolutely maximize output, a lot of the dynamic drivers at Kingtone is actually handmade. The quality is undeniable. Kingtone makes some of the best dynamic drivers in the market today, and while I cannot give you a list of IEMs that use their drivers, I can at least tell you which ones of my collaborations are currently using Kingtone dynamics. The 7Hz Zero, the 7Hz Zero 2, the Truth Ear Zero, the Truth Ear Zero Red, the Truth Ear Zero Blue 2, as well as the dynamic driver woofers in the Moondrop Dusk. An absolutely stacked resume. Basically, 6 out of 10 of my current collaborations are using Kingtone dynamics. I know it, they know it, and for my next IEM project, they were more than happy for us to work together to create my very own crinacle branded dynamic drivers. By the way, Kingtone doesn't have a website nor any kind of online presence outside of China, so if you are a brand right now who's interested in working with Kingtone, you either have to work with an OEM that just happens to use them as a supplier, or you have to know a guy. So now we have direct access to a dynamic driver manufacturer, and we can tweak our drivers to a near infinite degree at this point. As such, we have created the first dynamic drivers that are tuned to the JM1 ear gain shape. Working with them also allows us to tune our driver to the chamber rather than having to adjust the chamber to accommodate for the drivers. And once everything all comes together, what we have is that every acoustic component inside the Project Monolith is proprietary only to crinacle. The Project Monolith cannot be cloned. It is to a point where even the smallest little thing would throw the tuning out of balance. For example, when we first created the monolithic shell, we tuned it as is, raw brass and all. Then afterwards, we of course plated it with 18 karat gold, and the plating, as thin as it may be, completely changed the sound of the monolith thereafter. So something as small as a little gold plating on the inner cavity was enough for us to basically scrap everything and start over kind of from scratch. Which brings us to my next point. The Project Monolith is tuned fairly differently from all of our previous models. For the Project Monolith, we are going for an experimental, highly colored, bass-focused sound signature that also has a natural mid-range and a natural treble. Yes, I know that there is no shortage of bassy IEMs out on the market today, But a lot of these IEMs tend to be very one-track minded on how they tune their IEMs, focusing on the quantity of bass with virtually no regard on how the rest of the frequencies flow. Just like with the rest of the crine-ear IEMs, with the Project Monolith, we also strive to hit the population average diffuse field in the mid-range and the treble, but now we paired it with what some people might consider unhinged levels of bass. So now with the release of the crine-ear reference, using that as a reference, the Project Monolith is indeed bassy. There's a lot of sub-bass, just like with my other crine-ear models, as well as my own collaborations, but what takes a big departure from the rest of the crinacle crine-ear stuff is that I've added on mid-bass. Yes, the Project Monolith has been tuned to be intentionally mid-bassy. There's a lot of punch, a lot of thump, a lot of slam. That is completely by design. But because we have full control over all the drivers, the 8mm subwoofer is actually, subjectively speaking, faster than what the graphs would show. We put in a lot of bass, I know. But at the same time, we cannot allow the bass to absolutely ruin the timbre of the rest of the instruments. Which is why, while we have gone for a very highly colored tuning, we also need to ensure that there is some level of balance within this unbalanced sound. And like I said, this is an experimental tuning for a limited edition model. So for those of you who really like the sound of the Project Monolith, please just announce it to the world, tell everyone how you want more of it, because if no one likes it, I'm not gonna do it again. Now, this multi-dynamic monolithic design is also great for another thing, and that is how scalable it is. So while we use the CNC process to cut the shell out of a block of brass, this also means that it's theoretically possible with literally any other CNCable metal. So yes, like I mentioned, if I really wanted to do it out of gold, I can. It's just that it's way too expensive. Or if I want to be a cheapskate, I could do it out of aluminium, could do it out of magnesium. I don't think so. And if I found a factory with a drill bit hard enough, absolutely I can make a monolith out of tungsten. Haven't found that yet though. On top of that, the MDM structure is compatible with injection molding, which means that if I really wanted to press prices all the way down, I could make a monolith out of plastic. Or theoretically also possible with a die cast, assuming tolerances are good, but we'll see, future experiments ahead. What I'm saying is that while currently the MDM design is available exclusively in a luxurious product like the Project Monolith, in the future, eventually we'll be able to make it at a much bigger scale and at a much lower cost. And that is it. This is the Project Monolith, crine-ear's limited edition model for 2026. There will be models using MDM moving forward, so for those of you who have missed out on the Project Monolith, don't fret, there will be more. Maybe not in this specific configuration, but more in general. Once again, I thank all of you for your absolutely overwhelming support all the way from, again, the Project Meta days all the way down to today. Without you, crine-ear wouldn't survive, and we wouldn't have the funding to create more wild and wacky ideas and hopefully push them out into reality. I'll see you guys next week, and don't die. Fuck off.